Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my Metal Gear Solid V Explained lecture series. This will be lecture number 12, I believe. We'll be talking about missions 23 and 24, the White Mamba and Close Contact. Now, it's good to talk about these two together because they kind of tie in heavily with what I've been going on about with, these experimental child as a next generation super soldiers. Since about, this Africa campaign started, really Mission 18 especially is when it really started talking about it. And I've been kind of paddling around a truth here that we're gonna arrive at it at Mission 24 about who are Foxhound, where did they come from, what are the sort of like the main constituent parts of Foxhound, and just what all's going on behind the curtain there. So we'll get into that in Mission 24. Now, for Mission 23, White Mamba, we're going to talk about Eli. Now, we know Eli in the Phantom Pain is basically, he's Liquid Snake. He's, and, I'll get into this time period stuff even more when we get to the Code Talker mission, but we can assume probably that this mission is taking place in Afghanistan in 1991. I said Afghanistan, and I meant Africa. I'm just testing you. So in Africa, I don't know why I did that. In Africa in 91, I think is when we pick up Eli. So if he's born in 72, in 91, he'd be 19 years old. Well, think about how Eli constantly insists that he is not a child, and he hates people treating him like that, and Eli's not his name. Well, he's probably right, actually, about all that stuff. And I think he kind of knows it, but he can't really go against it or really prove it in any way, so he's just kind of stuck with it. It's like his cover identity for this operation. And so if you recall in Voices, I speculated Mission 20. I speculated that perhaps Big Boss and the sort of whatever the early prototype transformed version of Chico had gotten in a fight essentially with Big Boss. The two of them got in a fight, and probably Chico was killed, and probably it was pretty brutal. And so that's why he pops back up here in White Mamba. It's like Chico's gone for a little bit. We do this little back and forth with a copy of Snake, essentially. And then we go out and we get our kid back, basically. We get Chico back. But he's different. He's transformed now. We know Shabani to Eli. There's a difference in how they look and everything, so that probably relates to how I'm sure after Chico was killed and then came back, he probably had another kind of transformation. And given how Eli acts, Chico was probably a little ornery, probably kind of hard to deal with. Imagine, in his shoes, being forced into become kind of the leader of these brand new super soldiers who are transformed out of this parasite sort of magic technology, and then just kind of like, doing the best you can, but then failing, and then basically being punished for that. He probably felt pretty angry about it, and just like fed up and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's where a lot of Eli's personality comes from in the Phantom Pain. So note, Eli's weapons in this fight, I'm kind of skipping ahead, but you'll fight Eli in this mission. His weapons are a machete, a spear, and fire. He'll mostly attack you with a machete, but occasionally he'll grab this little pipe spear and throw it at you or stab you with it. And every once in a while, towards like the end of the fight, he'll throw some Molotov cocktails at you. Kind of brutal. But those are probably related to the weapons that we see. Sort of that, you remember that canceled, sort of, quote unquote, canceled Chico concept art from the Phantom Pain that shows him with like a machete and cutting weapons? I think that kind of relates here to Eli. And that's kind of your link there. Now, Bwala and Masa, I've said, is kind of the stand-in for the barracks. And we know the barracks have been destroyed and sort of converted into a base in all the other instances we've seen villages in this game. And so that's probably what Big Boss's whole crew was doing in Africa. And they had, I think, essentially been blazing a trail for their whole scheme. And Chico was just, I think, kind of left here. Like I said, I think Chico was they had planned on abandoning him. And I think that's what we're seeing here. The whole thing about, people in Bwala and Masa had been, the soldiers that were there in what would have been Mission 13 in Pitch Dark are now gone. And it's just these kids that are just running the whole place now. It's not like kids are being trained here. They're running the whole place. And there's no adults to be seen. Now, I mentioned in the last mission, one of the last two in War Economy, this Gunsmith stuff. And the Gunsmith was the one with all the kids, right? Well, and I didn't bring it up then, but let's bring it up now. How do you think the Gunsmith avoided the vocal cord parasite? If the Gunsmith's got these kids out there and the kids are immune to it, we know that the kids are immune because it just doesn't develop enough to actually create larvae and metamorphose the host, essentially, right? But we know the kids can also still be a carrier for those mating pairs and can transfer those parasites to another subject who, if they're adult, it'll infect them. So essentially, how did Gunsmith avoid being infected by his own kids? Because we'll get to it later. Every time a kid is brought back onto base later on in the game, we start getting problems. There's evidence that that's where actually the whole radiation thing, and I'll get to it, but the radiation leak in Diamond Dog's base is kind of tied to bringing these kids back on base. Later on, they'll escape, and we have to bring them back one by one. And after you get them all back, that's when the radiation leak happens, and then boom, Shining Lights Even in Death happens. So getting the kids back is essentially like getting the Foxhound unit finally fully under your control. Like they break out one last time, and you have to get them back again. And Eli's the leader. And he's the one that's responsible for all the stuff going on the base, too. He's the one who's constantly a thorn in our side for the rest of the game, and we have to go back. He challenges us multiple times, and that's probably what happened with Ishmael Snake and the future Ahab Chico Snake after he was brought back on. So going back to the Gunsmith, though, and how he avoided the getting infected, well, going back to if Gunsmith is Sigint, if he's Donald Anderson, and Donald Anderson is Drebin, well, we see Drebin at one point in Metal Gear Solid 4, Solid Snake asks, Old Snake, asks him if he's one of the Patriots. And Drebin begins to answer and says, I ain't no lolly lule. And you can tell he's trying to say Patriot, but his vocal linguistic control nanomachines kicked in and caused him to say lolly lule lo. And that's how it really works, is when someone with the Patriots vocal control nanomachines try to speak a word, the connection in their brain to that word is just replaced with the connection to the one that they want them to actually say, the word that the Patriots actually wants them to say. But to the subject who's saying it, they may not even realize it, because to them it's sort of like that connection in their brain is still there and they're still intending to make it. It's almost like their vocal cord just becomes hacked for a second. Since the vocal cord parasite essentially works by hacking the user's own vocal cords, that ties its own little operations in like its software. And we know Sigint is the software master. So Sigint would be the one who would be able to hack the vocal cord parasite. And so what does Drebin do when he says la li lule? He puts his fingers up to his throat like he's manipulating his vocal cords himself, and then he says, I ain't no patriot. Like he can say it then. So it's almost like he knows that he's got these vocal cord parasites, and he's just turning them off for a little bit. And I think that's what's going on with Gunsmith and how he stays immune to the vocal cord parasite while he's out here. The last thing to talk about here in White Mamba is the boat. Now, this is some heavy mystery stuff. Why is there a boat at Bwala and Masa at all? Why does Eli make the boat his throne? You know? Kind of placing himself as the metaphorical captain of this boat, you would say. If you've played Metal Gear Survive, you know the main character in that game is the captain. So, just the boat. Oh gosh, I don't even really want to get into it because Death Stranding 2 is coming up and there's a boat, the Magellan. So there's probably going to be a lot more to talk about when there's more stuff with that game released, but I'll just say I think the boat is tied up in future plans that Kojima has for the Fox Chico character archetype, which Sam is sort of a further elaboration on, which that's a Death Stranding thing, but anyways. That's enough for Chico, I think, for Eli right now in White Mamba. I know that was kind of a quick rundown, but we'll get into this stuff more. Mission 24 is Close Contact. So what's going on here is we got to pick up a couple of medical engineers that are out in Africa who were working at Skullface's Ngumba Industrial Zone at the Devil's House. And they're being held captive, and we have to also, for the mission tasks, get some containers, a bunch of goats, and an eagle, and an African peach. The mission tasks on this one, if you thought there were some weird, out-of-context mission tasks in this game, Close Contact is up there. Like, why would you be getting 6 goats and an eagle? Well, we'll get to it. So really, these two medical engineers, a man and a woman that you're picking up out in the jungle, is a way of speaking of what Sokolov and Paramedic were up to during the rebellion. Now, I've mentioned before that, Sokolov was Huey in Peace Walker, and Paramedic in Peace Walker was Strangelove. So what were Strangelove and Huey up to during the rebellion? And how did Strangelove get locked in, the AI pod? Or did she? Did anybody see her get locked in the AI pod? Did we just hear recordings of it and then assume because of the lack of her presence that she's dead? So this woman and this man, the woman is a medical engineer who really understands medicine, and the man is really just there to help set up the machines. And the two of them were working in Skullface's house, Devil's House, and helping him make the vocal cord parasite. So this probably indicates that back in the 70s, when Big Boss went on his mutiny, he probably grabbed up Paramedic and Sokolov, Strangelove and Huey, took them off, and probably used them to research, probably instructed them or forced them to research all of the new parasite weapons that he was about to use. So they're probably the ones responsible for the Archaea's creation, maybe even synthesizing the diamond itself as well. Possibly all of the Cobra strains were synthesized at this point and were used in making, in different mixtures and different ratios, and making all of the Foxhound soldiers, and that's why they all have a little bit different powers. They all kind of have a different specialty. So that's why we're picking up these materials containers at this other outpost that we start at. If you do the kind of the default closest starting zone, you have to go through this other outpost. And there's 4 containers you have to pick up total. And I believe 2 of them are biological material and 2 of them are, I think, metals. Correct me on that if you want, but or if you can, I mean, if I'm wrong. But these containers being biological stuff, especially the red ones are the biological containers. I know that all stands in probably for like the parasite research that was going on. Like I said, the archaea and the diamond. There was probably a heavy biological component to it all. For a lot of the other strains, at least. So that's why you're picking those up first. Oh, and when you get to this, once you leave that outpost and you start heading towards the place where the two engineers are being held captive, you get a call from Ocelot that says a couple of soldiers from, I think, the Rogue Coyote that are actually here that are operating, that's the Major's outfit that we ran into earlier. Again, that Major's probably a stand-in for Ocelot, so this is probably a stand-in for Ocelot's personal guard. And they're going to show up and take out these two targets. Excuse me, that's why we're here rescuing him right now, because it's like Big Boss is trying to wrap up his plans, and we got to we got to catch him. My goodness. And so once we show up at the scene finally, unless you're like super duper quick, I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure how the script runs, but yeah, actually I think it's on a timer. The man of the two will just stand up when he's kind of got a gap in the guards and just walk off on his own. And you have to go chase him down and find him before this other Jeep shows up and has a couple of soldiers in it that'll grab him. And I think possibly they'll execute him. I can't remember. I haven't failed that mission in a while, but you got to watch out for that. Now, you also have to get 2 Jeeps as one of the mission tasks. So just remember that. We got the 2 Jeeps. I'll come back to it in a second, though. It'll make more sense once I talk about everything else first. But those guys, they come up in one of the Jeeps that you have to get. And the other one shows up a little bit before that with a couple of guys in it. So the man is kind of a coward. Well, again, think of Sokolov. I mean, think of how he acted during Virtuous Mission and during most of Snake Eater, really. He's kind of a coward. And other forms of him, like Kenneth Baker. Kind of a snivelly coward. You know, he's kind of no good. He's you can't really trust a guy like that. So then if you pick the woman up and you listen to what she has to say, the metaphorical paramedic, she's got lots of stuff to say. She's talking about dermadromes, bolus pemphigoid, things she's never seen out like this, and she just doesn't understand why. Like, why would this even be a thing? I don't have the first freaking clue what dermadromes or bolus pemphigoid is. I'm sure someone who understands medicine really well would be able to interpret what she's saying. But I think without a medical degree or a lot of studying into it, I'm not going to really go into that. That's something you can maybe look into. But I think those symptoms relate to sort of the creation of the linguistic parasite in this game. But it also may have symbolic connections to how Foxhound was created. She also says that she's been here for 5 years. This 5 years thing comes up again when we pick up Code Talker. He says that the successful nuclear test, the detonation, was 5 years ago in the Indian Ocean. So that means she got here at the same time. So that Southern Indian Ocean test detonation is ground zeros. That is the test detonation is the pause bomb. That test with Pause and Chico blowing up and then transforming, that was the test that Big Boss was setting up in order to create his new super weapon, which is this. And that's why Code Talker talks about it. And that's what these two were dealing with. So the 5 years thing probably relates to, in this game, if I'm saying it was 91, 90, 89, 88, 87, 86. Probably relates back to when this whole game started. The 5 years ago thing is a hint as to how long you've been out here, essentially. Back in the 70s, it probably wasn't a 5 years ago meme. The 5 years thing changes in different games. It's a 5 somethings ago, something happened. When you first start Metal Gear Solid, and Solid Snake's being briefed by the Colonel for the first time, he says it all went down 5 hours ago on Shadow Moses Island. So there's always this thing that happened 5 somethings ago. I imagine there's probably 5 weeks ago. You could think of, wasn't there, I swear there was one pair of games that had a 5-year gap. And it's not coming to mind right now, but there's a 5 month, 5 year, I think 5 week, maybe even gap for lots of things. We know they waited 10 days to get pause, so that's a 5 thing doubled. There's I think that also relates back to the 5 main parts of the Ground Zeroes operation, the 4 side ops and the main op, kind of making up the whole thing. And this also probably relates to 5 being V. So there's a lot more probably in the dialogues that you can listen to yourself if you want to go check it out from those two. But those are your essentially your metaphorical Sokolov and paramedic stand-ins. And you go pick them up, and we learn about what all they've been doing. Now, you're not done with the mission yet. If you get them and you want to get all the mission tasks, there's a couple other things you got to go do. You got to get the 2 Jeeps. You've got to get an African peach. And you've got to get 6 goats and an eagle. Like, what? Why? Why is that even a mission task in Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain on Mission 24, Close Contact? Like, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I'll tell you. GOAT is an acronym, really. Most understand it as meaning the greatest of all time. Goats are also often used in sacrifices. A sacrificial goat is kind of a common phrase, right? And so if you're a fan of Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear the series, most people, by the time this game came out, I think considered the greatest of all time characters and the greatest of all time stuff. Most people agreed on it as being Metal Gear Solid, the first game. You get a lot of people that like 1, 2, 3, and 4 right differently. And a lot of people, the popular, quote-unquote popular view is that 3 is the greatest. But I've never shared that viewpoint. I think people who have been around since Metal Gear Solid 1's release have known, you really can't go back to what Metal Gear Solid 1 was like when it first came out, and there was no other game like it. Every other game that came after that, it was an iteration on something that you never were going to be able to capture again. And in fact, Metal Gear Solid 3 was one of the lowest selling of the mainline series. It wasn't that big of a deal when it came out, and it only became more popular later as more newer players came to the series. That was the one that kind of tended to grab most people because I think a lot of people were like, oh, go play it in chronological order and play Metal Gear Solid 3 first and then go back and play 1. And I think that is silly. I think, gosh, that is just the worst way to play this series. You got to play 1 first, and then you got to play 2 second, and then you got to play 3 third. That's why they're titled 1, 2, and... Well, the first one doesn't even have a 1, but we call it Metal Gear Solid 1. But that's why it's 1, 2, and 3. That's why they were made in that order, and that's why they were released in that order. And when you try to say that it's better to play the third one first and then go back and do it this other way, you're kind of saying that the guys who created this game and conceived it all as a series, when they first made it, that they didn't know what they were doing, and you know better. And I think that's a little arrogant and probably kind of short-sighted. The way the gameplay shifts, especially from 1 to 2 to 3, is just as inherent of a part of the story as any other thing that's going on. If you get 1 as the first one and you're introduced to Fox and Snake and Otacon and Metal Gear Rex and Liquid Snake and Ocelot and all that stuff, you need those as like the core essential elements of the Metal Gear Solid series. Metal Gear Solid 3 doesn't have all that stuff. It's about where all that stuff kind of came from, but it actually does have that stuff, But you won't know that it has that stuff if you haven't played the other two games, because it doesn't make itself apparent. It's camouflaged. Yeah. Like Fox himself is actually camouflaged in that game. Yeah. Just so we'll get... I'm not going to get into it here, but Gray Fox, when he travels back in time, he participates in the Snake Eater operation in 64. He's there probably during Virtuous Mission, and definitely there right after Virtuous Mission. I can tell you exactly what's going on with him, but we're not. We're going to do that some other time. That'll be another whole video. That'll be a fun one. So these 6 goats relate to the 6 greatest of all time kind of Metal Gear characters, really. And the one eagle relates to the 7th one that's part of this whole group. The 7 total are Foxhound. We've had the 5 plus 1 back in Blood Runs Deep, the 5 kids plus the 1 on his own, and then we also had the other plus 1 then in voices, Chico, who's separated from the rest, really Shabani. So that's really 6 kids plus the 1 commander. So you could think of the 1 commander that we murked or didn't back then in Mission 18 as kind of a stand-in for Revolver Ocelot. He's kind of the metaphorical commander, and I think Ocelot was kind of at first their commander in the field. So then the other 5 would have been Octopus, Raven, Wolf, Mantis, and Snake, because Snake's usually one of the people of Foxhound. And then the 7th one, who was separated on his own, was Fox. So that the 6th one, who's Snake, could be, you could consider that Solid Snake. It could be Liquid Snake. It could be Solidus Snake. It could also be Vamp. He could be probably any number of people that could be made to be Snake. These names are really just roles, and they're not necessarily individual persons. Maybe they were based on individual persons, but these 7 essentially become like symbolic roles. I'll go over them again. It's Ocelot, Octopus, Raven, Wolf, Mantis, Snake, and Fox. So the 6 goats stand for those first 6, really. And the eagle stands for Fox. Now, why does the eagle stand for Fox? Well, who was the voice actor who did Fox's English voice in Metal Gear Solid? A man named Greg Eagles. If you don't buy that, I understand. But that's really the best connection you can make between those 6 goats and 1 eagle. And like I said, the 6 plus 1 thing, it comes up again and again. And that's where, 6 plus 1, you could really take it as 6 sub-bosses kind of in the 1 main boss. And that later gets, after Fox Die is applied, we know Fox Die takes out 2 of them. So that 6 number becomes 4. And then the 1 main boss is kind of still there, but that's why we got the B&B Core and Dead Cell after Metal Gear Solid 1. And then their respective leaders being, Solidus and Ocelot. Or you could maybe consider Solidus as one of Dead Cell and Ocelot the leader of both. I don't know. It's funny. Anyways, it probably is more likely that Ocelot's kind of the one behind the scenes running Dead Cell and that whole operation into, because we know he betrays them all at the end and all that. So then the African Peach that you have to pick up after this, it's like I mentioned back in Mission 20 Voices. This African Peach it's up on the metaphorical vocal cords behind the metaphorical snake's mouth. That's essentially Fox Die. So we're getting this. It's essentially Mission 24 that stands for finally when Ishmael opened Frank's operation back in Rhodesia had finally caught the entirety of everything that had led to Foxhound's creation. He had finally gotten everything that led to Foxhound's creation. He had gotten the people who made it, all the materials, all of the personnel that were made. This was kind of like when everything was finally wrapped up. The Big Boss had probably already moved on and was doing the next part of his scheme, but we've still got a little bit of wrap up to do after this. But this is essentially the main part. So circling back to the 2 Jeeps, then, if the 6 goats and the eagle are the main bosses in Metal Gear Solid, and the African Peach is Fox Die, well then those 2 Jeeps must be standing in for the 2 Jeeps at the end in the Jeep chase. The 2 Snakes Jeeps, essentially. And so that's mission 24. It's all kind of set up for the Shadow Moses operation, actually, which we'll get to again, I'm sure. Finally, I have another note here, which I talked about last time, but I just want to mention it again, how at this point we're seeing that Africa is really used to represent Snake's body. It's got his mouth, it's kind of got his digestive tract here. It's also got some other parts too, like where all this research was kept in this other place, and how the region is restricted behind Minoko Yanyoka and everything. I'll get to it more later, but the river that goes through here also relates to it, and this river again is kind of related to the dried up river that I mentioned in Afghanistan, the River of Sorrow. This is it again. It's another incarnation of the River of Sorrow. So that's what's going on here, and we've got a fast flurry of missions coming up. Things start happening really fast for missions 25, 26, and 27. That'll probably be next lecture. I'll talk about all three of those. And then mission 28, Code Talker, that'll be a really long one, but I'll try to fit that one in with mission 29, Metallic Archaea. That'll probably be a longer video. And then we'll get to the really long part, missions 30 and 31, where we see what happens at the end of this whole chase. Because like I said, Big Boss is out blazing a trail through Africa and just sort of using all of this conflict that he brews up as a way of making his schemes. And now he's got his schemes made, and he's going to go off and just multiply it and make it global. And he's made his little stand-in parasite soldiers, made their little stand-in armors, which you can think of as sort of the prototypes that lead to the eventual stuff that made the B&B Corps what they were. And that's why I brought them up there too, and all that. So, yeah. Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain does this funny thing to you where it makes you feel like adjacent missions have nothing to do with one another. Like White Mamba and Close Contact, when you play them in the game, don't necessarily feel that connected at all. Like you go get these kids and then you go get these two engineers, and you can just kind of do it without really making the connections in your head as to why these things are happening adjacent to one another and right after voices, and why there's going back to, I wanted to mention this about Retake the Platform and War Economy. You can kind of see those two events as like the opposite sides of the same event. If Nova Braga is like your FOB, or someone else's FOB even, you're invading their FOB when you do that. And we'll come to it later, but Nova Braga is kind of a stand-in for the airport or the hangar of the Peace Walker equivalent of your base, which is kind of equivalent to the support platform. But really it implies that this is how people come and go from your base. And so what you're doing in Retake the Platform is a defending thing, but what you're doing in the War Economy is kind of an attacking someone else's base thing. So there's, like I said, how Mosquito is kind of a vamp, and how that CFA heavy hitter, the CFA, not heavy hitter, the CFA commander of that little regiment there is like another vamp. They literally could be like your vamp in one mission and then your Young Fox in the other mission, or maybe your back then I guess it would have been Frank in your Frank in one mission and then your vamp in the other mission. So you're literally playing both roles, maybe. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, it's Chico's all the way down, y'all. Literally, snakes all the way down, really. But anyways, hope you've enjoyed. That's the end of this one. Y'all catch you next time. Peace.